We're joined with Yves Engler on his new book, which is titled Stand on Guard for Whom? A People's History of the Canadian Military. And welcome, Yves.
Thanks for having me.
Well, if you don't already know, Yves Engler is Canada's foremost independent journalist and a prolific author. It's really hard to keep up with Yves. Not only does he write a lot of articles, but one book after the other. He's been compared to Noam Chomsky and I.F. Stone, but over the years, we've decided to call him Julelal. Jul Yves, Yves has always given us his time and his presence on the show for many years, and it wasn't too long ago, Yves, that we hosted a book launch of yours out here in Vancouver, the Rational and Co-op Radio, and you got together. I think it was Canada and Israel apartheid. But since then, you've had many, many book launches all over Canada, and you're really indefatigable. Yves, it's as though the last book didn't exhaust you. It's now on the military. But before we get into that, look, listeners, for some more information, just go to www.yvesengler.com. And another place that you can look up is Spartacus Books, because Yves is going to be there in person in a few days. So, Yves, it's really timely. This book is out during Novembrance Day. The military has always been in the news. We have a love-hate relation with it. I guess most of us have a hateful relationship with it, if I can use those words. And you have come out with a people's history of the military. It's the largest book that you have written. Just to let folks know a little bit about the table of contents. I'll get back to it because I just can't pull it up immediately, but it's massive. Oh, here we go. So it starts out with King and Empire Roots and Conquering Canada, which is a little bit about what I want to talk to you about first, Yves. But then it just goes on to all kinds of interesting topics around winning hearts and minds, around sort of movement in the shadows, nuclear Armageddon, of course, the culture of sexism and racism, which is in the news at this time, our subjects to Uncle Sam, NATO, the whole thing about veterans. And another thing that was really interesting was the marketing and the propaganda machine that is there existing with this military. So, Yves, first of all, thank you very much for joining us. Let's start off with talking about sort of the raison d'etre of the Canadian military, which really is settler colonialism. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? You've got a whole section on that in your book.
Well, I mean, the Canadian military began as the British military. Literally, everything gets transferred from British control to Canadian control. Like the military, the naval base in the Esquimalt and Halifax, what was the British military doing in Canada or in Turtle Island was, of course, dispossessing Indigenous people, and with the Mi'kmaq in the east and the Atlantic provinces, putting bounties on people's heads. In the West, there's a whole history of gunboat diplomacy up and down, basically from Victoria going northward in what is now British Columbia, intimidating Indigenous communities along the coast as gunboats and firing cannons in villages and perpetrating all kinds of massacres. That's the roots of the Canadian military. I mean, no one really denies that the Canadian military grows out of the British military. I mean, we still call it the Royal Canadian Air Force. So we have the Royal in there. That was something that Harper returned after a few decades after it had been taken out. So that's the roots of the Canadian military, and institutions like the Royal Military College in Kingston, Ontario, was set up in 1876 to train officers, as one academic, pro-military academic put it, to proper white gentlemen to be officers in the British military, and they were involved in suppressing the Métis and Indigenous uprisings in the today's prairies, and they were also involved in conquering Ghana and Nigeria and Kenya, and involved in wars in India and Afghanistan alongside the British Empire. So that's the roots of the Canadian military. There's all kinds of ways in which they've been directly involved in the dispossession of Indigenous people. Things like giving veteran land grants. So returning World War I and World War II and other war veterans received land for having fought. Sometimes it was directly taken from reserve land. Always it was on Indigenous land that had already been taken. Oftentimes bases have been direct theft of Indigenous land for bases. So the military, the Canadian military, has been involved in the dispossession of First Nations in a whole slew of different ways.
And talk about how very little has changed. I mean, from Gustafson Lake to Oka.
Yeah, I mean, the military continues to, in their counterinsurgency manual in 2007, they initially had the Mohawk Warrior Society essentially I think it basically listed as a terrorist group. It's like a threat. They ultimately withdrew that under a lot of pressure. Spying on I don't know more, involved in intelligence gathering in the big fracking fight in New Brunswick in 2013. So the military continues to be very much continues to see Indigenous resistance as a threat to the colonial order, and that's part of what they protect. When we talk about in the title of the book, "Stand on Guard for Whom," part of what they protect is the colonial order, and so that it's in a less violent way, but it's still than it was a century ago. But it's still right at the center of what the Canadian military is about.
Yves, let's just move on really quickly because we don't have a lot of time for today's discussion. But I let listeners know that if they go down to Spartacus Books, you're going to be there when exactly, in a couple of days?
Yeah, on November 14th at noon. That's a Sunday, November 14th at noon, doing a book launch there.
Great. Yves, we've heard over the last couple of years a lot of agitation around veterans, just seeking help, seeking assistance, and so on. Talk to us about how the military is regarding or treating its veterans.
Well, there's lots of history of being incredibly indifferent to veterans. Some of the worst stuff is during World War II. There was all kinds of chemical weapons tested on veterans who were generally either illiterate or quite poor and quite marginalized, and they got them to be to okay, in quotations, having different chemical weapons tested on them, and it took decades and decades for compensation to be paid out. The military is, they're gung ho about support our boys, and that's usually about as far as supporting whatever war effort the politicians choose, and they often leave the human toll of the war fighting for the individuals to deal with. The question of veterans is a complicated one, because veterans associations have been involved in all kinds of really important battles to win compensation for like the testing of Agent Orange around CFB Gagetown that was used by the Americans in Vietnam and stuff like that. So there's all kinds of battles that veterans associations award compensation for, which are very good political battles, and obviously if you're going to send people to war, it's the responsibility of the government and the state that sends those people to war to look after all the health effects, be it physical or mental, that come out of those war situations. But as you mentioned, we're moving towards Remembrance Day, and veterans associations also very much are kind of mobilized towards sort of martial patriotism. And if you look at how Veterans Affairs, one of the things of Veterans Affairs, it's this huge agency here, separate from the actual Department of National Defense, has like a $5 billion budget. Huge agency, and obviously the compensation and different benefits that it provides veterans is a good thing, but it also is incredibly propagandistic about Canadian wars. Look at what Veterans Affairs talks about Korea, World War I, and those things, fight for democracy and for freedom and stuff like that. And veterans and the sort of moral authority that veterans have has often been mobilized for sort of supporting militarism, for supporting government, pro-military kind of policies. So it's a little bit of a difficult one, because on one hand, I think people, we should be more sympathetic. We should be sympathetic to how veterans are mistreated often, but also be a little bit wary of the actual organized power of veterans, which is usually, not always, sometimes it's used for progressive purposes, but usually it's sort of mobilized for kind of militaristic reactionary purposes.
Yves, I want to just quickly move along and just hit some of these topics that have been so recently in the public media, in the news and so on. Talk to us about your chapter 11, A Culture of Sexism and Racism.
Yeah, obviously the sexism, the patriarchy of the military is something that's getting attention these days. It's the embodiment, the institutional embodiment of toxic masculinity. Women weren't allowed on submarines until 2000. This is not... you don't have to go very far back to have very explicit sexism within the force, and I think some of that context is left aside in the discussion that we're seeing in the press. Also, I think that is the incredible and the fact that this whole internal and it's this whole chain of command kind of structure which really enables sexual violence, sexual assault, sexual misconduct, and makes it difficult to report and difficult to counter. This whole history of patriarchy. Some of the elements of patriarchy are just beyond kind of bizarre, right? Like in the 1960s, the Department of National Defense was funding and had their researchers involved in trying to create a fruit machine to detect, supposedly a way to scientifically detect gay people, because they were obviously at that time purging all gay people into the 90s, officially purging all gay people from the military. When you look at the racism, explicit racism was the order of the day into the 1950s, right? It was, they had orders of there's only people of pure European descent that could be in the Air Force. It wasn't always applied completely, but the racism of the Canadian military in terms of excluding people of Asian descent, black people, was massive during World War I, World War II, and the Navy and the Air Force were obviously the worst. When you hear these stories today about white supremacists being attracted to the Canadian forces, there's, I think, a couple parts to that. One is it's this racist institution. We obviously know what happened with the whole Somalia affair in the early 90s when the neo-Nazi types were tortured Somali youth to death and involved in all kinds of explicit racism. But so there's this whole racist current to that appeals to the white supremacists. But there's also this sort of, I think, the authoritarian current to the military that's very appealing to sort of the organized far right. And so it's an institution that it really, from the perspective of those who believe in pluralism, who believe in democratic decision making, who believe in all people are equal. The military doesn't represent our values, and I think that progressive-minded people need to be a bit more explicit about that. This is an institution that very much upholds some of the most reactionary social values there are.
Yves, do we have any idea in terms of the extent of right-wing extremists or white supremacists that are actively in the military? Do we have any kind of idea as to the scope of that?
Well, there's lots of stories over the past 4 or 5 years that have detailed bits of that. It's 100,000 people in the military, so it's difficult to do a full audit, if you like. We don't know, but it's not a completely marginal phenomenon. That's for sure.
Well, yeah.
How widespread? It's hard to get a handle of that. There was when La Meute, which was this far right group here in Quebec that came onto the scene, I think in 2016, 2017. There was at one point there was some stories that looked at it. The proportion of the early founders of La Meute who were former military was like most of them. It was like a handful of people, a dozen people involved, but it was at most were former military. And the people in La Meute, then at one point the military put on a position that you couldn't be in La Meute if you were still in the military. And then the head of La Meute, the spokesman for La Meute, said that still lots of his former military buddies who were still in the force were still in different still active with the group. So it's hard to get a sense of exactly how widespread it is. But we also know, part of it is also that the far right, some of the people who have these visions of violent conflicts, they also join the military to get access to the skills and training that comes with being in the military.
Right, Yves, talk to us about the propaganda machine and marketing militarism.
Well, what we're going to see in the next 10, 11 days is Remembrance Day celebrations all across the country. Most of those will be funded by Veterans Affairs or the Department of National Defense. They're portrayed, very rare that it mentions that the funding, where the funding comes from. It's portrayed as this entirely kind of grassroots affair, but the huge amounts of public funds are spent on those efforts. And that's just one part. The Department of National Defense has the largest public relations apparatus in the country. There are hundreds and hundreds of full-time PR officials working for the military, and they have their own history department that's like the size of a major university history department. They fund all kinds of academics, defense studies programs across the country. Help set up a lot of them. It's a vast propaganda apparatus. They work with different media, historically involved in